Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, February 14th, 2022, Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day to all who, well, is it celebration, I guess. We have stopped thinking about it around here. Yes, it's a big celebration. You should have dinner out. Monday night is not a great night for Valentine's Day, typically speaking, but okay. Maybe you're going out to dinner. Maybe you're dining outdoors because you live in one of those places where it's still warm enough to do that. Maybe you're dining indoors because you're tired of the pandemic and you don't think you care anymore until you get COVID, at which point you'll be outraged or something like that. Lots you could be doing today. Things to contemplate for later on. We'll have to give it some thought. We barely made it to the microphone this morning after a wild Super Bowl party night. There was nobody over at my house. It was just us, and that's what we did. Not necessarily because pandemic, but because our teams aren't in the Super Bowl, and we don't follow football all that much anymore. But I did see it. That's one of the major television happenings and cultural events that was going on at the same time for everybody, and I did watch it. You don't stream it later or anything like that. I was there and I saw it, and I guess I probably saw the halftime show in near real time, if not maybe a little bit delayed by the DVR and such. But, and did all the American-style things, right? I feel like an alien here pretending to be American. We made chicken wings. So there you go. That's my cover. We had all kinds of good stuff. It was a good game. It seemed nice. People are upset. People are happy. People are talking about the officiating. Yeah, so seems like we're back. It's a typical American Super Bowl. The Canadian trucker-style protesters who had big plans to disrupt, so far the plans were for them to disrupt the Super Bowl and then drive across the country and possibly arrive in time in Washington, D.C. to disrupt the State of the Union address. Showed up and did not disrupt the Super Bowl. I mean, basically, I was daring them to disrupt. I dare you to actually try and block people from getting into the arena to watch the Super Bowl when they've paid $1 bazillion for the tickets. I read an interesting story about the price of ticket inflation for the Super Bowl in later years. But, I don't think they were actually interested in doing that. Very few people, a couple of people stood around with signs in the parking lot and said something about something, maybe I'm here about masking, maybe I'm here about vaccines, maybe not. And that was the extent of the protest. No word on whether there are trucks ready to roll, the things, lots of online chatter, but no materialization so far of any of these threatened caravans. But we'll see. They got plenty of time. March 3rd, I think, is when they were thinking about, it gives them like 2 weeks to get across the country, how they would disrupt the State of the Union, how they would prevent one person, who happens to be the President of the United States, from getting to the Capitol building to deliver a State of the Union address. Seems almost impossible, but you never know. I used to think that it would be impossible to storm the Capitol, and we found out that that was not impossible. So you never know. We'll see. Anyway, Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now, Bill tells me, all the way from Portland, Maine. Let's find out what I'm going to do today. Kagro X does all the news and stuff like that. Okay, we'll get to that. It's like, I don't know, current affairs, I think, because the cooking show is on another network. At least I know that much. We might as well start with the cooking show. I mean, let's see. We had the chicken wings and all the complicated stuff. Those little cocktail weenies in the blankets, pigs in blankets things. Very nice. All that great stuff. And gosh. And then I found out that there's hard soda now. There's a big advertiser in the on the air during the game, which I don't know. That's a little bit weird. That there's a lot less beer advertising, although the beer companies were advertising their hard sodas, and then most of the advertising was for how to. Well, it was weird with online betting being like, I don't know. I guess it's legal. It must be legal if you're advertising it, and crypto, which is largely the same thing. Very weird and different tenor to the advertising this year No blockbusters as far as I could tell. Anyway, Greg Dworkin is here. He's been rounding up the news. You probably watched this major game. I think in the broadcasting industry, you're not supposed to say the name of the... I don't know. I think there's a thing about saying Super Bowl.
Superb Owl.
Yeah, right. But people came up with all sorts of the big game and all. I think in advertising, you're not allowed to do it. Maybe you're allowed to just say it over and over again. We'll find out if YouTube has an algorithm to get rid of us for saying Super Bowl or the Super Bowl people were telling people that vaccines don't work or something like that. That I think you get rid of us for. But
well, it's a lot of Super Bowl stuff. Angry Staffer wrote my favorite tweet, which is the Bengals can still win if Mike Pence does the right thing. I did not watch the whole thing. I treated it like you generally treat a State of the Union or other major speech. I tuned in and out. I did watch the end of it to see who would win. I saw the part where it looked like they were playing football, and then it started to get to, all of a sudden they're starting to call things that they didn't call all game.
Right.
And Bengals were doing well until they started calling stuff. Then they weren't doing so well. It actually looked like they were going to stop the Rams. But that didn't happen, and so the Rams won, and the home team was happy. And, interestingly, and we'll get to the truckers and all that sort of stuff, but the LA Times had a piece entitled, "Many Republicans Think the NFL Does Too Much for Black Players and Are Losing Interest in the League," poll shows.
What are they doing?
The relentless culture wars appear to have taken a toll even on the NFL, with a large number of Republicans saying they've soured around the league and expressing disapproval of its efforts to improve the treatment of black players. I didn't watch the halftime show. I hear Eminem took a knee. Professional, I heard he was told not to, and he did anyway.
Ooh, that bad boy.
Professional football remains extremely popular. The poll found just more than half of American adults say they regard themselves as fans. The half that isn't. And an additional 15% say they're not fans but plan to watch the Super Bowl, which will be played Sunday, and it was. But the league's popularity has eroded somewhat in recent years, the poll found.
That's true. And I'm certainly less enthusiastic about it. And my version of watching the Super Bowl is it was on, and I heard things, and then when the game would stop and commercials would come on, I'd say, all right, let me see that. I watched, like a lot of people, watch the Super Bowl in reverse. Semi-interested in the game, mostly interested in commercials. Less and less lately, but yeah, all right. It was okay.
Right? And people who say they were less of a fan of the NFL now than 5 years ago are more likely to say the NFL is doing too much to show respect for its black players.
Oh, I do not have that problem. I just have other things to do.
Yeah. They're also significantly less likely to approve of the league's Rooney Rule, which for the last 2 decades has required NFL teams to interview minority candidates for head coaching positions and certain other high-level jobs.
Yeah, I disapprove of it because it's not left enough. By
contrast, another controversy involving the NFL, its response to the risk of long-term brain injuries shows no such pattern. 62% of Americans say the league has not done enough to respond to that risk. That's one of the reasons why I'm not so much of a fan anymore. Once I realized that they're all getting long-term brain injuries, I can't really get excited about watching them knock heads.
That put a damper on things for me, for sure. And then the New York Giants helped me out by helping me lose interest.
Well, the Jets have always helped me do that.
Yeah, well, there's always them for that.
Yeah.
Used to be the Bengals.
Speaking of the New York Giants, who are the Jersey Giants, to a certain extent, the best ad probably at the Super Bowl was the Sopranos ad for Chevy.
I like that one.
But you had to be a Sopranos fan to recognize that was a Sopranos daughter with a Sopranos theme song going to New Jersey.
Right. And the best question I saw asked about it was, is it legal to charge your own car in New Jersey? It's a good question. You can't fill your own gas tank.
Yeah.
So I don't get it.
I don't know. And the other thing you mentioned that the non-difference between crypto and gambling, but there was a ton of both. The other thing was the appearance of lots of QR ads, where you basically had to use your phone to scan to see what was going on, so somebody could steal your money.
Okay.
Or we don't know.
Yeah,
I think I'm getting a menu at the restaurant, and in fact, I just made a PayPal donation to some guy. In Illinois. I don't know.
I missed the ad, although I did hear from the other room. What the hell was that?
Yeah, it was a QR thing floating, and it turned out to be a crypto ad in the end.
It's because a lot of people, I did see people then on Twitter saying, by the way, just for, computer security sake, don't just scan random QR codes.
Right, because you'll be sending your money to who knows where.
So it's apparently not a super safe thing to do. And then if you find out it's crypto and that's pretty shady, that would really be so. Wouldn't that be great? What a great idea. Why didn't I think of it? I'm going to steal
Let's see. Other great tweets about the Super Bowl. Sean Spicer. What was the message of the halftime show? And Stacey Campbell said, show us on the critical race theory poster where this hurt you.
Yeah, there was a lot of backlash.
Or Glenn Youngkin just introduced a bill to ban the Super Bowl halftime show in Virginia schools. That was a good one.
That's right. There were some really good ones, good reactions, and some bad reactions. Charlie Kirk, I guess, took the lead as the chief aggrieved white guy, saying, what did he call it? Sexual anarchy.
Promiscuity, of course. I mean, a classic.
Anarchy, sexual anarchy. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing, but I guess, whatever. It's a white grievance, I guess. More controlled sex, I guess, is what the white people want today. I saw a halftime show meme, I think tweeted around by State Senator Louise Lucas, who is the Senate President pro tem in Virginia
person,
right?
Who's actually pretty funny.
Yeah, and she took that. What's that? That I don't know where that meme is coming from. One of the Pokemon cartoon memes where the guy was looking at the butterfly asking, "Is this CRT?" with Glenn Youngkin's face on it and looking at the halftime show.
Right.
He was very. I don't know. White people were very upset, and I don't know exactly why, but also people were upset because it was a dated show, which is what Super Bowl halftime shows are. But more, they were upset because they realized it was dated and aimed at them. And oh my God, I'm old now.
Right. Exactly.
So
instead of aiming at boomers, they were aiming at millennials who are now
or Gen
old.
X.
Okay, you people are old.
Yeah. That's us, or me. You're boomery, and I'm Xy, I guess.
So, a lot about the Super Bowl. Pretty much nobody's paying attention to the Olympics. Oh, by the way, that Russian teenager gets to skate again because, Russia and
they love Russia.
They get money. So
right.
The whole thing is corrupt.
IOC is in really bad shape, and
it's fake sports.
It's sad.
Real athletes trying to do real things, and then you get stuff like that, and they say, "Okay, let's just look the other way."
Right. Well, we don't want to ruin it for the athletes. Well, who do you want to ruin it for?
Not
your
that
rules.
The Olympic committees have ever done anything to harm their own athletes.
No. A hotbed of athletic harms. And in fact, there's a new story circulating about the U.S. snowboarding team having difficulties along the lines of the way the gymnastics team was having. A coach who's been a sex pest for a long time just being found out now. It really is rotten. And I feel so bad about it. Every time one of these things comes up and I realize it's a self-replicating problem because where are you going to look for coaches for the snowboard team? Former athletes. But the former athletes were brought up in this culture and they might not know what the hell's going on in life and what things are wrong, and it seems to perpetuate itself. It's very odd and sad. And
so here's a tweet from Louise Lucas.
Okay.
Brian Graham said, "Heard Youngkin thinks Louise Lucas is performing in the halftime show." And Louise Lucas said, "Nah, that's Mary J. Blige. I dance better."
Yes, I don't think we got to that story last week, but I guess Youngkin has one of those I can't tell black people apart problems.
Exactly.
And has been addressing people of color as though they were other people of color who look sometimes quite different. And but that's a Youngkin thing, and I guess people with fleece vests sometimes have trouble with these identifications.
The NFL said Charlie Kirk is now the League of Sexual Anarchy. That was his exact quote. "This halftime show should not be allowed on television." And another observer said, "Well, he saw Mary J. Blige in those boots and started missing the green M&Ms he's used to." And I'll just, this is a family show. I won't go on.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, we had wardrobe malfunctions in the past. And I don't know, Charlie Kirk might have been 11 at the time for that one. But who knows? I don't know. It's very upsetting to a very small, I hope, segment of super conservative white people who are looking for grievances. And I guess they found them, but I didn't find anything weird or upsetting about it, and I'm like 100. So
let's move to convoys. So
right.
I don't know if you know, but the Ambassador Bridge is open for business today.
Huzzah.
Some really, really interesting things going down, and still going down, of course, because Ottawa isn't cleaned up yet.
Okay.
But they decided Windsor was a bigger deal. The U.S. put a lot of pressure on Canada to do something. In fact, the Biden administration announced that things were resolved before the Canadians did.
Very anxious.
That was rude of us, it's just really interesting because somebody said, I guess there was a protest about something in L.A.
Yeah. One of those.
And the L.A. police force used tear gas to disperse the protesters.
Yeah, I think
and somebody made the observation, what do you think would happen, cultural clash, if L.A. and Ottawa changed police departments for a week?
Yeah. Well, that'd be, well, first of all, it's a much smaller police department. It's interesting. So I guess I was waiting for
here's what happened.
the LAPD to show up in Ottawa.
They got enough people to start doing the kettling thing where you wind up isolating groups of protesters from each other, and you turn a mob into dispirited individuals. That's the plan anyway. And they got tow trucks and other things to remove the trucks that were blocking the road.
Very nice.
They did it the Canadian way with sternly worded letters, tickets, arrests for mischief. They got about 25 arrests for that, but they cleared it. And Chris Ensing from the CBC says vehicle traffic is moving across the Ambassador Bridge for the first time since late Monday, 7 days ago. By the way, if you want to follow the American side of it, Detroit Free Press and Detroit News have excellent coverage of this.
Sure.
Ottawa Citizen has the Canadian side. Vehicle traffic is moving across the Ambassador Bridge. Arrests made, vehicles towed. There's limited access to some of the side roads, but basically they opened things up. And again, the Americans announced that this is what was going to happen. And so the trade aspects of it are fixed. And interestingly, then they're turning their attention to Ottawa. Ottawa is taking a couple of different approaches while the premier, the head of the province,
yes, okay, sure,
is talking about state of emergency, and the mayor is saying you have to stop this. But at the same time, the mayor was negotiating with one of the groups to at least get the big rigs and some of the louder trucks out of residential areas, which may or may not have succeeded. And then the question's going to be, because the Ottawa police chief has said we don't have enough staff to do the kettling thing the way they did in Windsor, which is a much smaller protest.
Okay.
And Trudeau is saying, well, you have enough. We're not giving you anything. And so that's an impasse that's going to have to get fixed because it makes Trudeau look powerless and silly, because this is essentially an insurrection. And so people have to understand that as that goes on. There's a wonderful piece from Hunter Walker, who has a newsletter called The Uprising, where he devotes all of his time to talking about January 6th, and he's covering this as an aspect of that. Canada's trucker protest in eerie echoes of January 6th. Anti-vaccine demonstrations in Ottawa have been encouraged and promoted by some of the same right-wing figures who loudly backed former President Trump's efforts to overturn his election loss.
Yeah. Well,
so he points out, for example, on Friday evening, American conservative activist Amy Kramer, you remember her? She was associated with setting up the January 6th.
The Women for...
Yeah, exactly. American conservative activist Amy Kramer sent out 2 tweets in support of truckers who are protesting COVID vaccine regulations in Canada, except that's not really what they're protesting. The messages, which came 1 minute apart, included hashtags promoting Freedom Convoy and a video showing some of the crowds who shut down streets in Ottawa. Yes. Hold the line, she wrote. It's the exact same phrase Kramer, one of the key figures behind the protests against Trump's election loss in 2020, used in the lead-up to January 6th. Kramer, who's the chairwoman of Women for America First, the group that planned the main January 6th rally on the Ellipse, used the Hold the Line hashtag to promote that event.
That's the only thing she's got. She didn't even spell it. She should have spelled it HOULD, hold the line, for Canadians.
Yeah, color. She added color to it. COLOUR.
It's not how that
These echoes of language from events that precipitated the violence at the U.S. Capitol are a stark example of how the Canadian vaccine protests have been encouraged and promoted to U.S. audiences by some of the same right-wing figures in the country, of course, including Fox News, who spends hours on it. Nothing on the January 6th committee, but hours on the Canadian protest.
Well, it's very exciting to them.
American support for the Canadian convoy has not been limited to tweets and broadcasts. The New Start Up Grid published a fantastic piece on Tuesday detailing how a close look at several Freedom Convoy groups and crowdfunding efforts showed the involvement of anonymous actors, deep-pocketed non-Canadian donors, and prominent U.S. right-wing political figures. And there are increasing indications that convoy protests, which have included members of white supremacist groups, QAnon adherents, and instances of violence and vandalism, could make their way south. It's interesting because some other folks have published some of the chatter between the groups trying to organize this. They're completely disorganized and upset that there's no key plan, as you were talking about, in terms of, for example, the State of the Union. And every time somebody asks, well, what's the plan? Who's in charge? What are we doing? Someone else will chime in and say, if you buy these T-shirts, half the money will go to your group. It's the grift has already started.
Well, that's what it's chiefly about. But yeah, I did say Canadian authorities, very much catching on to the fact that a lot of American actors involved in this. And I did see some chatter about it over the weekend, and then people like pushing back, like, I don't know whether they were right-wing figures in the United States denying that they were involved, or that they didn't like the wording of the accusation that Americans were meddling in Canadian affairs, but they are. So
well,
I think they're right about that.
Hunter Walker notes at the end, the whole situation recalls a famous Pierre Trudeau, father of the current leader, speech where he discussed living with the proximity of the United States. It's like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly or even-tempered, one is affected by every twitch and grunt.
Well, Pierre Trudeau may have had some experience with it. That we don't know. He was a very adventurous guy.
Wait, it doesn't stop there. So in Ottawa, because they haven't gotten their act together to decide exactly what it is they're going to do, they do seem to have some emergency operations centers set up so that all the different police forces, including the RCMP, are now speaking with and planning together with the Ottawa folks, so that's good.
Who's getting the Tim Hortons? But
David Reevely, who's an Ottawa reporter, has a short tweet thread about how the locals have really gotten annoyed with all of this because they're the ones that have to put up with the horns and stuff like that. And so somebody who does dog walking organized a local counter-protest, with great signs like "Make Ottawa Boring Again," But what they did is they surrounded some pickup trucks that were part of the convoy.
Pickup trucks, come on.
And they
probably electric.
Because they're not all truckers. And so they wouldn't let them go.
Who wouldn't let them go?
And so the locals surrounded the Freedom Convoy supporters in pickup trucks and would not let the pickup trucks go until they made the drivers come out and scrape Freedom Convoy stickers off the trucks or take flags down. And then they would let them go. So David Reevely has this whole thread here where he says, next guy starts scraping off a convoy sticker, crowd cheers. Stickers off, crowd leader with a bullhorn calls out to say the driver will go home, but the crowd demands he take his flag down first. After a short standoff, passenger gets out, takes down the flag, cheering gives way to the goodbye song. Police walk the truck out. Truck behind has already been de-symboled and follows.
Okay.
This is the first time I've been at a protest where whose streets? Our streets seemed really apt. It's really pretty funny. But that's, Canadian justice there.
Okay. And the dogs, took care of the owners took care of their waste and everything?
Yeah, of course. They're Canadian.
Great. So, well done. I've never really seen anybody disarm and
so this is the Canadian equivalent of a sternly worded letter, but the point is it works in Canada.
Yeah, right. Well, terrific. Good job. That great local knowledge and local application of Canadian know-how. KNOU.
Right, here's another one. We blocked the convoy in our neighborhood, BOUR, neighborhood, this morning at Riverside and Bank. We started with about 25 people. Hundreds more joined in solidarity. We made sure residents could get through, but kept the convoy here so it couldn't join the main branch here. So the Ottawa police, says Dr. Amit Arya, Let me get this straight. The Ottawa police, with a budget of $346.5 million, failed to act for weeks, but 25 courageous Ottawans started a blockade and countered the convoy and started to take back the city.
Yeah, I think you've got it straight. That's excellent, and great realization of the power that's available to regular people acting together.
And again, this is all part of January 6th, so there's a lot of different reasons for Americans to follow this, not just the entertainment value. And we'll talk about that and Trump and, what you do about him after the break, which is coming up.
Yes.
But some interesting legal theory about people like Madison Cawthorn and Donald Trump and what can you do with them.
Oh, all right. And that comes after the break because it's legal theory and it's longer than a minute?
Yep.
Okay. Well, fine. Terrific. Congratulations to the activists of Ottawa on finding out that there are sort of special powers that are available to just regular folks and that you thought were police powers, but in fact, they have to operate according to regulation and everyone's got an eye on them, properly so, to make sure that they don't overstep the authority they've been handed on behalf of the rest of you. But the rest of you don't have to hand that power to others all the time, and you're not threatening anybody with arrest or physical harm, and you just let it be known what your will is, and if you have great enough numbers.
I just like the whole idea that, at worst, they're being arrested for mischief.
Right. Well, oh, yeah. Well,
insurrection here, mischief there.
Yes. Well, okay. So far, so good. They haven't broken into Parliament at this point. That's probably one of the places you'll draw the line and things like that. So, all right. I'm glad this is winding down, that the Ambassador Bridge is open again, and I guess we'll see car parts flowing. So, all right, we'll return in a moment, and I'll get into the legal nitty-gritty of what's going to happen to Madison Cawthorn, if anything.
Sup, fam? It's your boy Darwin, a.k.a. Darwin_Darko, a.k.a. the most reasonable man in America, a.k.a. KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio with a U for our Canadian friends. I don't know, just throw a U in everything, and that way we feel like we're appealing to them, even though that's really the British people's fault. But a fun and friendly holdover from Britain that preserved by our Canadian friends to the north. Okay, so where were we? Oh yes, right. There were some long stories you were.
It's a lovely affectation, eh?
Yeah, I think it's fun, and too bad. I'm sorry about the whole insurrection thing spreading to your country.
So let's talk about
doing well with it.
And this just interesting. This goes in the Dems in disarray pile because there's really interesting Republican infighting going on, which of course indicates Dems in disarray because everything does. But
we're there too. Yes.
Yes. Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a Republican base focused on the 2020 election turns on Assembly Speaker Robin Vos.
Oh.
Robin Vos is a really conservative guy. He's probably a little to the right of Mitch McConnell. But he's facing calls to step off the tightrope he's been on for more than a year, navigating a Republican base that wants more scrutiny from him of the 2020 election.
Mm-hmm.
That's election with a U for our Canadian friends. And the reality of President Donald Trump's loss. A growing number of Republicans outside the Wisconsin state capitol are furious with the Assembly Speaker and are demanding that he resign from his leadership position after he punished Timothy Ramthun, who does have a U in his name, over false claims about the 2020 election, a move that helped catapult the Fond du Lac County lawmaker to a campaign for governor. The discipline of Ramthun has enraged elements of the party faithful who already believe the powerful Republican, that's Voss, in the state capitol is refusing to do everything he can to litigate the last presidential election.
Well,
that's a key thing, because litigating the last presidential election is what separates MAGA from the rest of the Republicans.
Yes.
So that's going to come up as a theme over and over and over. By the way, I should say as an aside, half my family's in Canada, in Toronto, so I feel perfectly comfortable making fun of them.
Okay.
Whenever they come to visit, they make fun of us. So now 2 of the 3 top Republican campaigns for governor are entirely focused on ousting Voss. He may have done some good things, but I think the damage he's done to the party since November of 2020 is unforgivable. Terry Brand, chairman of the Langlade County Republican Party, said, anywhere from discontent to furious are the emotions I've experienced with people from around the state, around northern Wisconsin, and so forth.
All right. Well, not always felt everywhere in Wisconsin.
So basically, it doesn't matter how far right you are, it's never far right enough.
Well, yeah, if you're not signed on for the it was stolen from Trump agenda, we'll see. I'll be interested in the future. I'd like to fast forward 20, 30 years and find out if there are other Republicans who can command the same sort of thing and say, you need to say that my election was stolen or else you're not a real Republican.
Meanwhile, David French has an interesting piece in the Dispatch, which is a conservative newsletter. He writes under the French press, seeds of political violence are being sown in church. The new insurrection is being organized in a sanctuary near you. And he talks about what made the news. You may have heard about it in Castle Rock, colorado, a group called FEC United. FEC stands for Faith, Education, and Commerce. Held a town hall meeting that featured a potpourri of GOP candidates and election conspiracy theorists, most notably John Eastman. During the meeting, a man named Sean Smith accused Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold of election misconduct. You know, if you're involved in election fraud, you deserve to hang, he said. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways.
Wow. Well, maybe they need an inquisition.
I was accused of endorsing violence, he went on. I'm not endorsing violence. I'm saying once you put your hand on a hot stove, you get burned.
Okay.
As soon as he said you deserve to hang, an audience member said, yeah, and applause filled the room, and you can watch the moment because he gave a link, entirely almost ignored by the national media, is worth noting, but perhaps the most ominous aspect was its location, a church called The Rock. If you think it's remotely unusual that a truly extremist event was held at a church, you're not familiar with far-right roadshows that are stoking extremism in church after church at event after event. And then he goes on and has a whole list of how this happens.
Well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when it comes to Christian nationalism, the bar for concern has been passed by any conceivable measure. When a movement is strong enough to storm the Capitol, it's worth continued monitoring and continued concern. Moreover, it's important to understand why it continues to flourish. Flourish has a U there, just the way it's supposed to. And why it is so difficult to understand, much less combat. Okay.
Okay.
First, MAGA Christian nationalism is emotional and spiritual, not intellectual, not ideological.
It's certainly not intellectual. You don't need to convince me.
Okay. It's Baylor University historian Thomas Kidd said it's a more visceral reaction than rationally chosen stance. For example, I recently saw a yard sign, Kidd said, that read, "Make faith great again, Trump 2020." And I wondered, how can re-electing Donald Trump make faith great again? What faith? Well. When did it stop being great? If faith is, is what it is, then how can you make it great again? No coherent answer would be forthcoming, but that's the point. The sign speaks to a person's ethnic, religious, and cultural identity in ways easier to notice than it is to explain.
Hey, that's identity politics. You can't
do
that.
But a MAGA Christian would read the sign and know exactly what it means. When Trump wins, America wins, and faith wins, and you don't have to explain it.
Yeah.
Take it on faith,
Sure. They have their own code. They always have.
Second, MAGA Christian nationalism is concentrated in the churches most removed from elite American culture and talks about the fact that the people who will talk about evangelical life, culture, or anything else that you might see on media, TV, names you might recognize, or names that you are told are famous and stand and maybe have doctor in front of this and this and that and everything. They have nothing to do with where these churches are and what people say and do.
Oh.
Pentecostal Christianity, despite its immense size, he writes, is about as far from elite American culture as Mercury is from Mars. And this means it's quite distant from elite evangelical culture as well. Right-wing blue-check theologians and pastors who speak disdainfully of warnings about Christian nationalism because it's not something they see never darken the door of a Pentecostal church. They're almost wholly unfamiliar with the world of prophets and apostles, like Paula White, Pentecostal pastor herself, who was Trump's spiritual advisor. Trumpism penetrated Pentecostalism early, and I don't mean to say all Pentecostals are Trump supporters, much less Christian nationalists, but you can't understand the Trumpist Christian core without understanding its Pentecostal connection. Okay. And we've said this often. If you don't understand white evangelical connections to the Trump movement and the MAGA movement, you're missing everything, because that's what that's all about. And that's one of the reasons why they are so stringently diehard about inclusion.
Yeah. Against it.
They're against including anybody else because it's really them versus everybody.
Yeah.
Third, MAGA Christian nationalism is often rooted in purported prophecies. I've spent every single day of the Trump era living deep in the heart of Trump country, surrounded by Trump-supporting friends and attending church with Trump-supporting Christians. If there's anything I know by heart, it's the Christian case for Trump. I've read all the essays. I've heard all the arguments. It's in the air out here. It's the pragmatic or prudential cost-benefit analysis. He's a bad man, et cetera, et cetera. His judicial appointments are good, however. The leftist groans are terrible. You have to do this. But there's also another argument entirely, one that's impossible to discuss rationally, that Trump is divinely anointed to save this nation from imminent destruction. And then he describes some examples of that. And he said it's possible to overreact to this, to paint with too broad a brush, but basically watch Michael Flynn. Watch him speak in front of the evangelical mainstream. Watch the things that he says. In fact, one underappreciated reason why conspiracies that Antifa was at least partly responsible for January 6th, or that the attack was incited by the FBI, have taken hold, is the firm conviction in many Republican hearts that Republicans don't act like that. That's not what we do. So there has to be some other explanation.
Yeah. Well, they do.
We have to be careful, he says, when dealing with a potentially insurrectionary subculture. It's important to separate it from the population, wrongly tie them to the mainstream, and members of the mainstream may wrongly see the insurrectionists as allies. But underreaction can be dangerous too. We know that fanatical religious subcultures can do an immense amount of damage to the body politic. So the sin of commission is threat inflation. The sin of omission is the deafening silence. Moreover, if Christians know anything about the far right, they know it's vicious. The proper response to fear and fanaticism is reason and faith. It's demonstrating by word and deed. He's one of the good guy conservatives, by the way. But we have to know what we face, and what we face is a Christian subculture that's full of terrible religious purpose.
Yeah, well.
And so, just be aware of that, and it always flies under the radar, and places like the Washington Post and the New York Times almost deliberately refuse to write about that stuff.
Well, it's difficult to cover, difficult to stomach.
They want to avoid the controversy.
Yeah. All right. Well, so there's basically a group out there that are Christianizing the Q conspiracy is really what's going on.
Right, exactly. But when you think about that, then you go back to the trucker protests in Canada, and you might ask such things as, well, what are your demands? What are you trying to do?
Oh, yeah. Remember when they asked that about protesters?
And
I remember now.
They don't have specific ones. They would like Justin Trudeau to step down, and the Canadian government to be annulled, and all the sex trafficking to stop, and all the other Q stuff. But some people have compared it to Occupy Wall Street. It's a feeling rather than a specific planned out protest.
There are no demands.
There are no demands. The point is to advertise and inform people that what the Canadian government is doing is wrong, and therefore it has to change. And you get it, you understand, or you don't. But if you do, we don't have to explain it. So, this whole idea of appealing to the emotions, I don't like the way things are. They must be responsible this whole revolt against the elites is part and parcel of why Trump won. And so that's why it's important. And
All
not
right.
to just marginalize.
Well, anyway, they're weird. And by the way, I just figured out how you can defeat
They're weird,
it.
but they vote.
I am going to start a Pentecostal church called The Paper, and I will be able to defeat them. With the rock.
Well,
and,
the scissors.
I don't think that there's even such a church. So
yes, no,
can't
but I'm
happen.
going to have a commercial venture. It's going to be little minivans in every corner selling tacos and scissors. And there's nothing you can do about it because you're paper.
Okay. Well, at least I beat
So
them.
this one is from Michael Shearer and Josh Dawsey in the Washington Post. A weakened Trump, as some voters edge away, he battles parts of the Republican Party he once ran. And it's stuff about how Mitch McConnell is trying to get people like the governor of Arizona to run for Senate against Mark Kelly, trying to get the Sununu's of New Hampshire to run for Senate. Didn't always work. Everything that McConnell is trying to do is not necessarily 100% on target here. Sometimes he loses the argument, but what he's trying to do is shore up the establishment part of the Republican Party, and the fact that he is waging a rearguard, probably losing action, is really not the point. The point is he can do this because Trump doesn't have the hold on the party that he once did. That was just unthinkable a year ago.
All right.
So there is evidence that slowly but surely, as Trump insists on focusing on 2020 and the Republicans are trying to focus on 2022, that there'll be more and more splits within that party. Again, that's one of the reasons why the January 6th committee, in terms of their work and public information, is going to be so important. And here we get to some of the theories, legal theories, behind what's going on there.
Okay.
All right.
Legal
so
theory.
You have the January 6th committee doing their job. And yes, we understand that if you can tell a story, if you can present a coherent narrative that's both logical and emotional, defending the United States, insurrection, and label those folks as insurrectionists, it means a lot politically. But it might mean something legally, too. So FindLaw has this frequently answered and asked question, frequently asked, and they decide to answer it.
All right.
About the 14th Amendment, and that's where Madison Cawthorn comes into it.
All right.
What the Constitution says, 14th Amendment, Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof.
Another reason why those electoral slates from weird states might be invalid. No one's applied that yet. But
Well,
okay.
what does the Constitution say about insurrection?
Yeah, what does
Section
it say?
3 of the 14th Amendment prohibits anybody who's previously taken an oath of office from holding public office if they've engaged in insurrection.
Well, they did.
This means, at least theoretically, that politicians who participate or encourage a rebellion against government can not only be removed from office, but prevented from holding state and federal office in the future. However, how disqualification works has never been clear.
Right.
And that's really going to
Except
be
for
the
when
issue.
When they first passed the amendment, it was clear. Were you in the Confederate Army? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. You
But who does it?
participated. Right.
Is this something that's
yes,
reserved
that's
for the
true.
Congress? Because if it is, it's not something that North Carolina can do to Madison Cawthorn. The Congress can.
Maybe.
I don't think anybody argues that part. But where is state power in this federal Constitution outlined? And I don't think it is. And so the argument's going to be on Cawthorn's part is, okay, North Carolina, you can censure me if you want to, but you can't ban me. That's a power reserved for Congress. It's in the Constitution, not your Constitution.
Yeah. Well, maybe. I mean, if he's talking only about the power to declare someone definitively an insurrectionist,
Yes.
the state does appear to have reserved its, maybe an unconstitutional reservation of power, but North Carolina in particular says, no, we empower our state board of elections to apply sanctions against people so determined. Now the question is, where will they be determined? Right.
So in the Volokh conspiracy, Jonathan Adler, conservative lawyer, argues why efforts to throw Representative Cawthorn off the ballot are likely unconstitutional. Basically, even if Mr. Cawthorn were an insurrectionist, a matter of legal and factual debate, it wouldn't be a permanent bar. The Constitution provides that Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such disability.
That's pretty.
We don't know whether Congress will decide. But the Constitution is clear. The decision isn't North Carolina's to make. States can't review a candidate's qualifications because the Constitution reserves that power to Congress itself.
Yes, but I would argue that once elected, it's up to the Congress to determine whether or not he meets the qualifications. When the question is, shall you have access to the state-controlled ballot, even for federal office? I think there's a state question there that's pretty clear. Otherwise, we'd have federalized ballots, and we're not going to let Jonathan Adler fall prey to the accusation that he's trying to federalize elections, which is the Republican rallying cry right now. You can't have these election protection pieces of legislation considered in Congress, because that would federalize elections, and everyone knows that the states have the prerogative to run the elections, except Jonathan Adler, who says for the moment, because it's convenient, that in North Carolina it's the exact opposite with respect to this one guy.
But even Jonathan Adler would admit under oath that,
don't take an oath,
Congress can do it.
You're in trouble afterwards. Yes, they can do it.
So keep that in mind and set it aside while we look at this next question.
Okay.
Could the disqualification clause prevent Donald Trump from running for president in 2024? Now, theoretically, yes. In other words, this has nothing to do with impeachment. And the fact that if you're impeached, they can also say that, okay, well, now you can't serve. Right. Separately, because of the 14th Amendment, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power to disqualify somebody who's already held a public office from holding any office if they participate in an insurrection or rebellion against the United States. And that's a majority vote.
Well, all right.
But since this mechanism has never been used against the president, there's still questions to resolve. And I get that there's questions. There's questions about whether you can do it for Trump. There's questions about whether you can do it state level for Cawthorn. But what if, and just hear me out, and this was an idea I saw proposed by a Daily Kos poster named Private Jarhead, who I suppose has something to do with the Marines, who said, look, what if the January 6th committee is putting together a coherent narrative that, yes, this was insurrection and here's the proof. And as a congressional committee, they declare that this was an insurrection and the following people, there's evidence that they participated, be it, Andy Biggs or Paul Gosar or Madison Cawthorn or Donald Trump.
Okay, yes.
And having then determined at a congressional committee level, which I suppose the House can vote on as a resolution if they want to, this was insurrection, establishing in whatever form, you're the expert on this, not me, but the House establishes that these people were involved in insurrection. And following that, by majority vote, could the House and Senate then ban those people, whoever they are, from office? And that would include Cawthorn, and that would include Trump. Is that where this is going?
Maybe. I mean, that's a possibility, and it's certainly worth thinking about. Yeah, you'd probably have to have both houses of Congress make that decision. But I don't know why they couldn't declare.
But if it's a majority vote, you could do that.
I think so, yes.
It's not impossible.
Then we'd have Jonathan Adler say, well, no, you need to have a 2/3 vote in order to. Well, no, I don't think so.
No, you don't. No, this is a majority vote. And by the way, Jonathan Adler, if you don't like it, sue me. In the meantime, these guys are out until you win your suit.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
And that may take years. Oh, well.
one outcome. Yeah, and I don't know what he was talking about. I understand what he was pointing at when he was saying, well, 2/3 can remove the disability. That's true, but as a way of arguing that, oh, well, the ban isn't necessarily permanent.
I mean, if you get big enough, partisan majority,
you're not getting that anytime soon.
But you're not getting that anytime soon, right? I just think it's a fascinating way to think about it. And even if it doesn't exactly play out that way, the logic of having the committee clearly establish that these guys were involved in insurrection opens up a whole bunch of stuff.
Including legislative purpose, in case you had something else in mind or thought you doubted that they had a legitimate legislative purpose and therefore weren't a legitimate committee. One legislative purpose could be a joint resolution declaring this to have been an insurrection and the following people are involved. Yeah, true, sure. Right. Why not?
Now, what comes of that politically? I don't know.
Yeah, me neither. But try it.
I think they may. I mean, so I'm just looking at this with interest because I think it's more than just, okay, we're going to do a Super Bowl halftime show based on all the information we've gathered and hope people watch. I think it's more than that. How much more than that? I don't know. Is it going to be a referral to the Department of Justice? I don't know. Is it going to be a vote on whether these folks are qualified to hold office in future? I don't know. But all of it's possible if you do a good job.
I guess so. And they better do a good job, too. Now, I would imagine by the end of the day, Republicans will be threatening, well, when we take over the majority, we're just going to declare Nancy Pelosi an insurrectionist and kick her out. Now, you can't kick her out of Congress without that 2/3 vote, but you could theoretically say, next time you can't run, that's an option that's available to you. And then
it's pretty good.
We'll see whether Jonathan Adler comes to her defense and says, no, she can be on the ballot in California, or whether he suddenly forgets that that's a thing.
Well, if you want to disqualify somebody who's ready to step down and retire, and that's the
you should do it.
Trade, I'd take that trade.
Okay. Yeah, right. There's a few more years left, maybe, of Madison Cawthorn. So.
Yeah, I would. Well, look, I would bar Trump from office and Cawthorn and Gosar and Andy Biggs and Mo Brooks. And in return, Nancy Pelosi retires. I'll take that trade.
Might very well
and
take
two
it
draft
too.
choice and some cash.
Right. She'll say, you know what? Okay, I'm out of here for the good of the country.
For the good of the country. I'll join Al Gore in retirement.
Right.
In exile.
You might. All right. Well, it's a good thought. Well worth thinking about. And we'll settle. We could give some more thought to whether or not the states really have the right to control their ballots. But it is an interesting problem for Republicans because up to now, the Republican line has been, no, states control ballot access. All right, well, then we'll use it
Here's
to
the fun part of the show for me, and I get to say to David, okay, and I'll just throw in your lap the idea of what does it take to formally make this an insurrection?
Yeah.
That's not my problem.
And
That's your problem.
do it. All right. It's a process. Sounds like a me problem.
Is it a joint resolution? Is it just a report of the committee? What do you need?
I don't imagine a report of the committee would do much. Probably for something like that, the courts would would demand something extraordinarily serious, clear, and with a high bar.
A sternly worded letter?
No, I imagine they would ask for an act of Congress of some kind here. A joint or concurrent resolution. I guess you'd need something that has the force of law, and I can never remember which one it is.
But whichever it is, does Biden have to sign it?
Not unless it's a bill. If it's a joint resolution.
That still has the force of law?
Yes, there are such resolutions. Now, I'm trying to think, though. There's one.
See why this show is fun? I get to ask these questions. I don't have to know squat about what the answer is.
You just ask.
I just ask. I'm just asking questions here, folks.
Two forms of bicameral resolution, concurrent and joint. And we'll straighten it out. But one of them is something you would use, like I think a concurrent resolution is something that you would use for like a budget. That's the House or Senate will pass a concurrent resolution that doesn't need the president's signature, but is binding on Congress. And that's an interesting question. Now, if you're talking about barring people from Congress, would a concurrent resolution that doesn't need the president's signature work?
Concurrent resolution for Cawthorn and a joint resolution for Trump?
Maybe. But as long as you're doing it, you might as well get both. And The next question is, would Biden be willing to sign such a thing? And I'm not certain that he would.
No, I'm not certain that he would either. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Now, a joint
It'd be
resolution
good for Congress to do that. Maybe bad for Biden to do it.
Yeah. Right. Possibly. All right. Well, this is very interesting. There are different routes that they can take. Not sure what a court would demand, and for a normal court, it'd be a ticklish question.
I could take the approach of saying, look, I read a suggestion, and I don't care what it means. I just know how it feels.
Yes.
Or I could just ask David, what does it really mean?
Well, we'll find out. All right. I guess now we have to parse through that, at least for the next segment, or because we only have a 1 minute break in between segments. I can't.
Right. Well, maybe for tomorrow or even Wednesday. But I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. Okay. That's a thing to talk to Joan about too. Although I have a feeling that it ends the same way. I don't know. You look it up. Oh. And then tell me so I can write it up.
That's my favorite kind of.
That usually works. Okay.
What does doing the research mean? It means I asked David to do it.
Yeah. Right. You can do it. It's like Uber, but for research.
Well, I wonder if CRS has done anything on this.
They've done almost everything there is to do. It's possible.
That's why I asked.
All right.
When I start asking these questions, somebody come in, CRS did this 2 years ago.
That's usually the case, and they update it every once in a while. Someone will ask that question. All right. Well, we'll look it up and see whether there's anything on CRS. Wow. All right, we can do it now.
Yeah, and you thought you had the day off. All right, so welcome to Monday. That's how we wrap up the weekend. Things are getting better in Canada. Things are getting weird in the United States. And the Super Bowl's over, and Mike Pence didn't intervene. And so those of you who are hoping he would, I don't know what you're going to do now. I will see you on Wednesday, and David's going to take it for the next hour.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Greg. A good puzzle to start off with. And, about 30 seconds before we play the outro music. But I am reminded in looking at the way insurrection gets defined and the things surrounding insurrection of the statute that seeks to, that imposes a punishment for insurrection that starts off with whoever incites, sets on foot, or assists or engages in any rebellion or insurrection. And my thoughts go back to the fact that Donald Trump actually set himself up to stand out there and said, let's march, which is about as literal an interpretation of sets on foot as there could possibly be. Even in archaic law, he was like, let's go back and make sure I violate it properly by actually setting people on foot. All right. So archaic language, old amendments, and dusty parts of the Constitution. Thanks, Greg. We appreciate it, and we'll see you on Wednesday. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Oh, Darwin Darko with the fun comment in the KITM hashtag column here. In other news, the dog waste from the Canadian counter-protests all relocated from Canada to my garbage can. That's exactly right. Still a continuing problem. But now we have to go out there and try. Today's garbage day, so we got to bring in the garbage cans as soon as the show is over, so that there's less opportunity for people out there walking their dogs. And it's cold today, so I don't know how much dog walking is going on. Not protracted dog walking anyway. But prevent them. If we don't leave the can there, they can't put the waste in it. They can put it where it was once sitting, but all right, we'll see if we can get to that. Certainly, well, we'll wait until after the show. Meanwhile, there is CRS work on this question, but now I'm thinking maybe it's a short piece that Greg referred to, the Jonathan Adler piece at the Volokh Conspiracy, and maybe we ought to read through it just so we know what we're dealing with, and we'll see how well it matches the CRS work and our thoughts about I don't know whether he's done anything to reconcile it with the rest of the Republican crowd insisting that states actually have enormous power and ballot access, except for this time. I don't know. I find that a little weird. All right, so let's see. Adler writing here, why efforts to throw Representative Cawthorn off the ballot are likely unconstitutional. We'll see, and it'll take some time, but we'll wait and find out. But he's referring or relying here on another professor Professor Derek Muller, with just the U, like the Canadian U, but not the UE, Mueller, like Robert. But okay, anyway, Professor Derek Muller explains why states cannot invoke Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to exclude those who sought to overturn the 2020 election results from the ballot. We'll see how it goes. Some folks, Jonathan Adler says, have argued, and it's the State Board of Elections of North Carolina. It's not just some folks. It's a fairly significant body. Anyway, some folks have argued that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment bars those who supported the January 6th assault on the Capitol or other efforts to overturn the 2020 election from running for public office. Democratic Party lawyer Mark Elias, for instance, has suggested that Section 3 should bar some Republican members of Congress from running for re-election. Some voters in North Carolina have even filed a complaint to keep Madison Cawthorn off the ballot. North Carolina voters may have good reason not to want Cawthorn as one of their representatives in Congress. I sure wouldn't. Yet the effort to force him off the ballot is ill-advised and, as Professor Derek Muller explains in the Wall Street Journal, likely unconstitutional. We'll see then what parts Adler pulls from Mueller's piece in order to bolster this conclusion. And it may very well be ill-advised. It's entirely, like I said, it's among the things that Republicans seek to turn the tables on Democrats. They say, if you press forward with the January 6th insurrection investigation, we will investigate Democrats for something else and throw them out of Congress. And you might wonder, like what? And in some cases, there are theories and stories that they have made up about Democratic members, some of which have more kernels of truth behind them than others that they think will serve. But then there's just the regular plain old crazy notion that underlies all of this stuff. Everything from the Canadian caravan insurrection, we're here to throw Justin Trudeau out of office and all of Parliament should resign because we're angry about something and we're not sure what it is, or it's a lot of things. I'm not sure if we're angry equally about all of them or just a little bit about a bunch of things. But surely the Prime Minister has to resign. Well, he really doesn't. Similarly, Republicans love rallying around the idea that somehow Democrats that they don't like, the things that they've done are treason and they should all be killed for it, as opposed to, well, let's defeat them in the election. Of course, we're having to deal with that problem too, with a slightly smaller number of Republicans, except they appear to be engaging in just that activity. But yeah, I mean, you could both sides it by saying, well, Republicans are constantly accusing Democrats of treason too, and what's so crazy about their accusations versus yours? And it's like, well, they, killed people and beat up police officers and sacked the Capitol, and that's what we're accusing them of having done. That is insurrection or possibly treason. And your description of insurrection and treason is voting for certain things as members of Congress or preferring certain principles of policy making, which is a little more difficult to describe in the mainstream, among mainstream folks, as insurrectionist. But I know you do it with great gusto. Does that matter? Does your level of enthusiasm count? It shouldn't. All right, so what is in Professor Muller's Wall Street Journal piece that so impressed Jonathan Adler? The U.S. Constitution, Muller writes, doesn't allow states to invent qualifications for serving in Congress and exclude candidates from the ballot for failing to meet them. Yet that is precisely what the North Carolina State Board of Elections is trying to do to Representative Madison Cawthorn. It would be unconstitutional if the North Carolina State Election Board attempted to take Mr. Cawthorn off the ballot. In 1995, the Supreme Court held in U.S. Term Limits Incorporated v. Thornton that a term limits amendment in Arkansas couldn't apply to congressional candidates. The qualifications enumerated in the Constitution, the court explained, are fixed and exclusive. I mean, this is been used in solid instances before. When a state tries to enforce an existing constitutional qualification, it may believe it is acting appropriately, but when it does so months ahead of Election Day, it often adds a qualification that the Constitution forbids. Even if Mr. Cawthorn were an insurrectionist, a matter of legal and factual debate, it wouldn't be a permanent bar to holding office. This is the weak part here. The Constitution provides that Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such a disability. Well, considering that it's almost impossible to get the House to 2/3 on naming a post office anymore, the idea that, even if Republicans are in the majority, that they'd be able to muster a 2/3 majority to remove the disability seems like a long shot. The way to get them to removing that disability by a vote of 2/3, though, could be for Republicans to take Democratic hostages and say, we're going to disqualify, in coordination with state boards of elections in Republican-controlled states where there are still, nonetheless, Democratic members of Congress serving. We can start disqualifying some of them, and then you'll see that we're all just, we can go on forever with this hostage-taking game, and won't we all just lend one another the support to remove such a disability by a 2/3 vote, even though, in all likelihood, anything that they would come up with respect to Democrats serving in the House, for instance, that would measure up to this insurrection bar, sounds like they're going to have a lot of work on their hands manufacturing the insurrection that they're talking about. But they're capable of anything. I don't know. I just find that awfully dumb, though, to say, well, even if he were an insurrectionist, it wouldn't be a permanent bar to holding office. It would be, unless, the bar is explicitly permanent. It's just that it's possible to undo it by 2/3 vote of each house, which also is kind of weird, by the way. And maybe suggests that there's something at work here that doesn't necessarily fit under the precedent of U.S. term limits v. Thornton here, which is to say, like, for instance, the 2/3 thing you recognize. It takes 2/3 vote of the House to expel a member of the House. And the Senate, by the way, has no say in it, because each House is, under constitutional prerogative, the determinant of the qualifications and eligibility of its members to continue in office. So there wouldn't be a proper role for the Senate in ejecting a member of the House. However, to remove the bar from holding office that comes from the 14th Amendment, it requires a 2/3 vote of each House to remove the disability. That's kind of interesting. So the fact that you're writing a role in, and a supermajority role at that, writing a role in for the Senate in qualifications of a member for the House, or vice versa, suggests that you're on a different playing field from the ordinary situation. Like, for instance, the Supreme Court's consideration of term limits, state-passed term limits, in term limits v. Thornton here. And because you're on different footing, I'd have to give that some more thought, but that does seem kind of interesting here. I've never really stopped and given it any thought before that you would need to vote of 2/3 of each House to remove the disability. Why? Why would you need the input of the Senate on the qualifications of a person elected to the House? And it's because you're talking about a constitutional amendment that changed things here. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the states can be the one to make the call, but it does suggest that it requires some additional scrutiny. Anyway, we don't know whether Congress will decide before Election Day to bar from the House all who were involved in the events of the January 6th riot. But the Constitution is clear. The decision isn't North Carolina's to make. Maybe. States can't review a candidate's qualifications because the Constitution reserves that power to Congress itself. If voters elect a rascal who is constitutionally ineligible to serve, the people's representatives must decide whether or not to throw him out of the House. That's clear if he's elected, but he can't get elected if he's not on the ballot. Or, I mean, presumably there won't be enough write-ins to elect him. But I guess barring that, but it's a different question whether or not someone is constitutionally ineligible to serve. And like, for instance, no one argues, I presume, that it takes an act of Congress for the State Board of Elections to say, you haven't gathered enough signatures, let's say, in order to qualify for the ballot. Or even, if you want to run under the banner of a different party, that party hasn't qualified for ballot space. Or you didn't file the right paperwork or pay the right fees, whatever it is, the, nuts and bolts of what a candidate needs to do to put themselves on the ballot. If that has failed, but hasn't been, something that was designed by the federal government, it was designed by the state government instead. I don't know that anybody has ever successfully sued claiming that that's unconstitutional and a extra constitutional barrier to their service and therefore invalid. I think we've pretty much recognized the right of states to control access to their ballots with, at least with minimal requirements to demonstrate that you're an actual candidate. And I don't think anybody has ever interfered with those things. And if they say, well, one of the things is you got to get enough signatures and you got to file this paperwork by a certain date and you got to pay a small fee to the clerk in order to process those papers. And also you can't have participated in an insurrection to overthrow the United States government at any point. I don't know that that's really all that outrageous or something that the courts wouldn't recognize. Now, it may be that Republican courts won't recognize it because there's a Republican's rights at stake, and they'll just say, well, to hell with all of that if a Republican is in trouble. Anyway, for more from Professor Miller on why lawsuits and other efforts to keep, quote, insurrectionists off the ballot are likely unconstitutional, see here. What is here? Here is the electionlawblog.org, where Derek Muller writes on January 11th of this year, can states exclude from the ballot congressional candidates they deem lack the qualifications for office? And that's a slightly more involved look, but not even all that long there either. All right, let's go down the rabbit hole. Why not? Some private plaintiffs have sued to try to exclude Representative Madison Cawthorn from the North Carolina congressional ballot on the grounds that he engaged in, well, it says right here, the grounds that he engaged in, quote, insurrection or rebellion. It says a typo here, which disqualifies him from office under the 14th Amendment. As North Carolina State Board of Elections prepares to hear the challenge in short order, I'm skeptical the state has the power to exclude congressional candidates from the ballot. I wrote earlier about excluding presidential candidates from the ballot on the basis that they lack the qualifications for federal office. I believe states may but not must exclude candidates. The state legislature's power to direct... this is interesting too. I guess because it applies to the presidential election. We've shifted from congressional to presidential for this matter here, for the sake of this argument. Mueller says, I wrote earlier about excluding presidential candidates from the ballot on the basis that they lack the qualifications from federal office. I believe states may, but not must, exclude candidates. The state legislature's power to direct the manner of appointing electors, a big deal for Republicans contesting the 2020 election right now, under the big lie. But you'll recall, of course, that they think that what that means is that the state legislature can reserve to itself the right to overturn the results of the election in their states and appoint electors of their choosing, even after opting to hold a election and then holding it and then getting the results. which I don't think anybody really believes in their heart of hearts. But anyway, the state legislature's power to direct the manner of appointing electors, I think, extends to some qualifications determinations. Many states don't have rules like this, and many ineligible candidates have appeared on the ballot, as that post detailed. Nevertheless, I think it's within the state's power to exclude if it had a statute to that effect, at least for presidential candidates. The same is not true, in my judgment, for congressional candidates. I detail the reasons for this difference in Scrutinizing Federal Electoral Qualifications, a probably much longer article. And at any rate, he summarizes the argument here, I think, as the Constitution provides. Each House shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. But remember that this is a different mechanism here. There are instances where Congress's judgment of qualifications was a candidate an inhabitant of the state or a mere transient. How should Congress handle an underage candidate who will come of age after the congressional term starts, etc.? So there are instances where Congress's judgment of qualifications may differ from how a state or a court might determine them. And it is the right of the people to choose their representative unimpeded by ex ante state determinations, even if the right to choose someone the people know or suspect is not qualified for office. I draw a line from Rodebush v. Hartke. I don't know how you pronounce either of those names really, but in 1972 Supreme Court case emphasizing that recounts in a state were okay as long as they did not thwart Congress's role in being the judge of its elections at the end of the day. A state's determination that a candidate is not qualified thwarts that role. I don't know if I agree. I think, again, here we're conflating ballot access with election. The Congress is the judge of its elections, but if the guy hasn't been able to stand for election because he doesn't qualify for ballot access, on what basis does the Congress say he's been elected? We're the judge of its elections, and he wasn't in one. So what are we judging here? I don't know that this holds. While states have the power over the manner of congressional elections, that power does not extend to adding qualifications for office or the related power of adjudicating qualifications. I make this argument in Weaponizing the Ballot, another of his outside articles. A state can develop rules over the mechanics of appearing on the ballot, including threshold levels of support. Okay, he's answering some of my question here. But cannot extend to substantive evaluation of candidates. This seems strange in a sense. If my argument holds, it means flagrantly ineligible candidates, non-citizens, 15-year-olds, and so on, appear on the ballot and can, quote, win an election. But it's happened before, and it's not the state's place to exclude such candidates. It's left for the people to choose their candidates and for Congress to judge whether those candidates are qualified. I made this claim when challenges to Senator Mary Landrieu's inhabitancy floated up several years ago, although that case is also different, as you only have to be an inhabitant when elected, and early ballot access determinations are even weaker. It's a little esoteric, but okay. Two other details to consider. First, the Constitution provides each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 expel a member. There have been no efforts in Congress to expel its own sitting members on this ground, despite a successful effort to impeach former President Trump after he left office. This is not really relevant to the analysis above, but an interesting question about the power of Congress that has not been used, but now is sought to be enforced by private litigants. That's a good question, too. Right. If it was being, if you're sitting now in the proceedings of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, and people say, well, he's an insurrectionist, so he should be thrown out. Well, how do you know he's an insurrectionist? Well, we say so at this point is basically all there is. And they would say, well, has anybody official said so? Like, for instance, has there been a vote called in the House of Representatives to expel Madison Cawthorn from Congress based on his being an insurrectionist? And the answer is no, there hasn't been. And it's not that there haven't been people who have proposed it, but nobody has actually move forward with the vote because I think they know that they won't get the 2/3 that it would require to kick him out, and it would just be a giant embarrassment. Although, they might want to try it anyway and just have a giant embarrassment for Madison Cawthorn just being accused. But of course, if they don't get the 2/3, then the Cawthorn's lawyers and all this will say, well, look, the Congress has one method available to it to declare somebody to have been an insurrectionist and therefore disqualified from office and expelled from the House, and they either didn't even try or they tried and failed. So here, haven't you failed to define Cawthorn as an insurrectionist? Who gets to say that the guy's an insurrectionist? That's a legitimate question. Now, second, we're getting to the end of this one. The most plausible way forward is for the North Carolina State Board of Elections, or NCSBE, to construe its jurisdiction narrowly under the enabling statute. Its jurisdiction extends to evaluating the qualifications of a candidate, which means a person having filed a notice of candidacy under the appropriate statute for any elective office in this state. It's plausible to read this statute to exclude federal offices. Oh, I see. If you say you've filed notice of candidacy under the appropriate statute for any elective office in this state, meaning elective offices of this state. Although, again, the framers of this statute surely knew the difference between in and of, and they chose in. So, I don't know. It's plausible to read the statute to exclude federal offices. A related provision explains grounds for filing a challenge are that the candidate does not meet the constitutional or statutory qualifications for the office, including residency. Residency is not a qualification for federal office, it's inhabitancy for Congress, and it's been used for, among other things, county sheriff candidates in North Carolina, etc. Again, an emphasis that the scope was intended for state candidates, not federal. That's not to say that it's not plausible to read the jurisdictional grant more broadly. Including residency doesn't exclude federal grounds, I know, but it is to say that some complicated question could be avoided if read narrowly. Yeah, okay. But then they could also decide not to avoid it, and then you're back where you started. I mean, if they chose to do this, then they might be able to read the statute differently such that they don't have to make this decision after all. But if they're inclined to make this decision, I don't know if any of these arguments necessarily are determinative in terms of whether or not the courts would uphold the right of the state elections board to say you don't qualify for the ballot. Now, I said there was some research, CRS writing on this, and as we approach our next break, we'll see if we can squeeze a bit of it in. I don't think we can do the whole thing because it's pretty lengthy too, but might not all have to be read aloud. Let's see. And it's pretty recent. And it was clearly motivated by the January 6th insurrection. It's dated January 29th, 2021, and it's a little mini CRS report. It's not a full CRS report. It's actually labeled Congressional Research Service Legal Sidebar. So I don't know whether that's a new category or what. But that's the way it's labeled. The Insurrection Bar to Office, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It seems pretty on point, so let's start. In the aftermath of the events of January 6th, in and around the Capitol, there have been calls for accountability for those who participated, as well as leaders who may have helped instigate it. The breach of the Capitol resulted in numerous injuries, multiple deaths, and significant property damage. It also delayed the Congress's constitutional duty of certifying electoral votes for President-elect Joseph Biden and caused Capitol Police and other law enforcement personnel to evacuate the Vice President and members of Congress from the House and Senate floors to safer locations. You knew all of that. Some observers, historians, and other commentators are wondering whether the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment might provide a mechanism to disqualify from holding office individuals who participated in or encouraged the siege, including former and sitting government officials. Invocation of the Disqualification Clause could raise a number of novel legal questions involving the activities that could trigger disqualification, the offices to which disqualification might apply, and mechanisms by which disqualification could be enforced. The clause has been seldom used, and the few times it has mainly arose out of the Civil War. A very different context from the events of January 6th. It is therefore unclear how much past precedents provide useful guidance for its application to the events of January 6th. This legal sidebar describes the disqualification clause, explains to whom it might apply and what activities could incur a bar on holding office, and discusses possible mechanisms to implement it. And that's, I guess, what we're interested in primarily. The Disqualifications Clause, of course, in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment provides, and we'll tell you as the music begins to play, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector or of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of the state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, but Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Okay, so now you have it on record. We'll ponder it for 2 minutes. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay. There's so many things that I wanted to bring to your attention, but this now has captured my attention, so it's capturing yours too. I'm just curious to see what CRS has laid out here. They, and after reciting the disqualification clause, they summarize by saying, in short, Section 3 appears to apply to any covered person who has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and thereafter either, 1, engages in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or 2, gives aid or comfort to the enemies of the United States unless a supermajority of Congress removes such disability. Enacted in the aftermath of the Civil War, it seems specifically designed for the Reconstruction era, but it has not expired and may be applicable to modern times as well. Section 3 was, for the most part, used only for the short period between its ratification and the 1872 enactment of the Amnesty Act. You recall that's what Cawthorn's lawyers were invoking earlier. The Amnesty Act removed the disqualification from most Confederates and their sympathizers and was enacted by a 2/3 majority in accordance with the terms of Section 3. That's interesting to note as well. The Amnesty Act appears to be retrospective and apparently would not apply to later insurrections or treasonous acts. That's what Cawthorn is claiming, that by its terms, it applies to all insurrections or traitorous, treasonous acts, past, present, or future, by referring to any person, like even any future person. But it seems like an extraordinary legislative purpose to say that Congress would, in the wake of a insurrection that tore the country apart for 4 years and saw a president assassinated, would say all members of Congress in the future have a free pass to stage insurrections against the United States if they feel like it. And there are no charges that can ever be brought against them, no matter how serious the insurrection was, because Amnesty Act. Okay, that does seem unlikely. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not expressly require a conviction, and historically, one was not necessary. So that's also an important thing. Like, you don't have to be convicted of insurrection in a court of, a competent court of law anywhere, or an incompetent one for that matter. But a lot of people thought that might be the case, and it's not unreasonable as a first guess. Well, if you're convicted, then yes, and if you're not convicted, then why should you be disqualified? If there's a possibility of convicting you, why not do it? But that's interesting. It says that it hasn't been necessary historically. Reconstruction-era federal prosecutors brought civil actions in court to oust officials linked to the Confederacy, and Congress in some cases took action to refuse to seat members. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was last used in 1919 to refuse to seat a socialist congressman. How about that? Republicans love that. Accused of having given aid and comfort to Germany during the First World War, irrespective of the Amnesty Act. The congressman, Victor Berger, was eventually seated at a subsequent Congress after the Supreme Court threw out his espionage conviction for judicial bias. It's kind of interesting. To whom does Section 3 apply? And remember also here that, as it mentions here, Section 3 was used to refuse to seat a socialist congressman. And there's a link here. I'm just sort of curious where these things go. But last used in 1919 is linked. Excluding lawmakers under the 14th Amendment, no easy task. A roll call article from January 12th of last year, so immediately after, 6 days after the insurrection. It may not be the tool some Democrats think it is to use against members who voted against certifying Biden's election results. Yeah, okay, that might be of some interest too, but I think it's all probably covered here in CRS. But just interesting, voting not to seat somebody is also a different vote from voting to expel somebody. Once you're seated, expulsion requires a 2/3 vote. Voting not to accept the credentials or otherwise come up with a reason not to seat someone who hasn't yet been seated is just another instance where it's just a majority vote for that. So different thresholds indicate that you're talking about different things here. Anyway, to whom does Section 3 apply? The bar against office holding applies to members of Congress, officers of the United States, members of state legislatures, and state executive or judicial officers who previously swore an oath, you know this from the language, to support the Constitution of the United States and later break that oath by committing the acts mentioned. The offices to which such persons are then barred include seats in Congress, membership of the Electoral College, and any civil or military office under the United States or any state. Now, of course, there are probably Republicans out there who say, yeah, so Joe Biden, he can't be president anymore. We got to kick him out of office because he did the treason. Which, it's one thing to disagree with somebody and say, that's treason, and therefore breaking your oath to uphold the Constitution. Or you lied about something. You said you would be faithfully upholding the Constitution, and you issued an executive order that was later even struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Well, obviously, you broke your oath to uphold the Constitution by enacting this or signing this executive order. Well, you might have a better case in saying if he signs the executive order and the Supreme Court invalidates it and he tries to enforce it anyway, but it's still, within the contemplation of the Constitution that a officer of the United States will try to do something and have it challenged, but as long as you submit to the authority of the courts to determine whether or not your action was unconstitutional, I think that's still upholding. We've generally still thought that was upholding the Constitution and your oath to it. But anyway, Okay, so the offices to which the persons are then barred include, well, everything that we listed before. Although not expressly referenced, the bar appears historically to have applied to judgeships. Although, wasn't it mentioned? All right. Oh, the bar. Well, the judgeships are mentioned in the part of the clause listing the different kinds of people who can break their oaths and who would be subject to it. That's interesting. Anyway, there may be an argument that because the president is not covered explicitly by the provisions, the presidency itself is exempt from the disqualification. Okay, I see what you mean, but not a great one. In contrast, for example, the impeachment clause of the Constitution applies to the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States, which suggests in that clause that the president is included as an officer of the United States, unlike members of Congress and electors, which may be why they are expressly included. One scholar notes the drafting history of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment also suggests the president is covered, and does so with this quote, I guess, from the drafting history. During the debate on Section 3, one senator asked why ex-Confederates, quote, may be elected president or vice president of the United States, and why did you all omit to exclude them? I do not understand them to be excluded from the privilege of holding the two highest offices in the gift of the nation. Another senator replied that the lack of specific language on the presidency and vice presidency was irrelevant. Let me call the senator's attention to the words, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. Certainly that's an office under the United States, yes? So that was good enough for them then. What triggers the bar? Determining who has engaged in either of the two disqualifying activities, that is, engaging in insurrection or rebellion, or giving aid or comfort to an enemy, is likely to be a difficult task, given the scarcity of precedents and lack of clear definitions. Now, under insurrection and rebellion, it says the Constitution does not define insurrection or rebellion. The Constitution does, however, empower Congress to call forth the militia to suppress insurrection. It seems to follow that Congress has the authority to define insurrection for that purpose, which it has arguably done through the enactment of the Insurrection Act. Part of that act authorizes the president to call up the militia and armed forces in the event of unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States that make it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. That language might provide a point of reference for interpreting the 14th Amendment. Another part of the Insurrection Act, enacted approximately 3 years after the 14th Amendment, and thus arguably particularly relevant, authorizes the use of armed forces in cases where insurrectionists oppose or obstruct the execution of the laws of the United States or impede the course of justice under those laws. Congressional activities, including fulfilling the constitutional duty of certifying electoral votes, would arguably qualify as an execution of the laws of the United States. The availability of judicial proceedings to enforce the law, however, may provide a countervailing consideration. As the Supreme Court has observed, in the context of the Insurrection Act, it is generally up to the president to determine whether a civil disturbance rises to the level of an insurrection or obstruction of the laws serious enough to overcome the ability of civil authorities to suppress it. Consequently, a presidential invocation of the Insurrection Act would likely suffice to establish the existence of an insurrection for 14th Amendment disqualification purposes. However, presidential invocation of the Act might not be necessary. One reminder here, of course, is that there was, for a while, the thinking that it was the plan of the Trump administration to invoke the Insurrection Act once the anticipated pushback from the Antifa super soldiers assembled by the millions outside of the Capitol became evident. And worth noting, again, another one of those laws without backstops and without, and just designed like a president would never do that. if all it takes is for the president to invoke the Insurrection Act in order to trigger that bar and say that anybody who's participating in X is in fact participating in insurrection, the plan was for Trump to do that, but to do it with respect to, anybody standing in the way of his plans to overturn the election. That the president is empowered with the ability to simply, like we worried about with the Patriot Act and terrorism labels, simply label one side insurrectionists. And then anybody who, I don't know how many people who actively would have participated along with Antifa had they even been there in counter-protesting the insurrection was ever going to run for Congress. But I guess if you did, you could be disqualified under the 14th Amendment because the then president said you were an insurrectionist and invoked the Insurrection Act, and that was all it took to do it. And you might also be able to argue that any members of Congress who supported the people being labeled as insurrectionists by Donald Trump would also be subject to these disqualifications. It might be best overall if you just relied on the 2/3 standard for expulsion and didn't do much else. But since you'll never get there, you're just going to end up with a Congress full of insurrectionists all the time. And that seems like a bad idea too. All right. 2 constitutional powers also arguably authorize Congress to determine the occurrence of an insurrection by legislation. They haven't yet done that. The Militia Clause and Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. The Militia Clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, grants Congress the authority to call forth the militia to suppress insurrections. And when they first mentioned that a few paragraphs ago, I said, well, that's interesting. What does it take to do that? Is the fact that members of both sides, on both sides of the aisle and possibly in both houses, at some point called on the president to send the National Guard immediately to suppress this insurrection? Or does it require an act of Congress, which, of course, they couldn't have done because they were under pressure from the insurrectionists? This makes for an interesting catch-22. I would declare you an insurrectionist, but you won't get off the floor in order for me to do that. So that makes it a little difficult. But there is another mechanism. We'll see what it is. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment provides Congress the power to enforce the amendment by appropriate legislation, which I guess you could do after the fact. A legislative determination that an insurrection occurred, past tense, pursuant to one of these constitutional authorities would likely at least be accorded judicial weight in the event of a prosecution for insurrection or any procedure Congress might put in place to determine disqualifications under Section 3. Once an insurrection is deemed to have occurred, and again, that could be by, legislative act, and the window's closing on the ability to pass such an act, by the way, while you have a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic President, probably your best shot at doing something like that. And as far as tit-for-tat retaliation by Republicans, well, for the next 2 years anyway, it would be awfully difficult to imagine even a majority Republican House and Senate passing and then getting signed by a Democratic president legislation declaring Democrats to be insurrectionists for whatever reason. Once an insurrection is deemed to have occurred, if you can get to that point, the question becomes whether a specific person engaged in it. Section 3 does not establish a procedure for determining who is subject to the proscription on holding office, instead providing only a process by which the disability may be removed, i.e. by 2/3 vote in both houses. Congress also has not set forth a procedure for determining who is subject to the disability imposed by Section 3. Although definitions of insurrection and rebellion for purposes of the 14th Amendment would not necessarily be confined by statute, it would appear that a criminal conviction for insurrection or the levying war prong of treason would provide sufficient proof, and each of them contains a bar on holding office. The insurrection statute at 18 U.S. Code Section 2383 provides, whoever incites, sets on foot, assists or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or the laws thereof, or gives aid and comfort thereto, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years, or both, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. That section has come to our attention before, and we've commented before. It's almost as if Trump set out purposefully to violate that statute by having the rally at the Ellipse and then saying, let's march down to the Capitol. That's the setting on foot. You can't get any more literal than that, I guess, other than coming out and saying, let us set out on foot for the Capitol and lay siege to it. The treason statute at 18 U.S. Code section 2381, right nearby, similarly provides in relevant part, whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them is guilty of treason and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States, possibly also because they're dead, but that's not in the statute. But it is available. Next up, aid or comfort to the enemy. One who gives aid or comfort to the enemy of an enemy of the Constitution of the United States is also disqualified from holding office under the 14th Amendment. This language appears to mirror that in the Constitution's Treason Clause, which defines treason in part as adherence to U.S. enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Scant Supreme Court case law arising out of World War II, defining the provision of aid and comfort, indicates that mere association with an enemy is probably insufficient, but that otherwise innocuous acts may suffice if they are intended to provide material advantage to an enemy. There also is some indication of how aid or comfort was interpreted under Section 3 soon after its ratification, after the Civil War, during a hearing to determine whether John D. Young provided aid and comfort to the Confederacy and therefore was ineligible to be seated in the House of Representatives. The Committee of Elections was of the opinion that aid and comfort may be given to an enemy by words of encouragement or the expression of an opinion from one occupying an influential position, like, for instance, walking out of the Senate and raising a fist toward the assembled mob outside, as Josh Hawley did. Could that be enough? One difficulty in applying the aid or comfort prong to the recent unrest at the Capitol may lie in the proper definition of enemy. The term enemy is traditionally understood to encompass citizens of foreign countries in open hostilities with the United States. During the Civil War, the Supreme Court clarified that citizens of the Confederacy, while not foreign, may be treated as enemies as well as traitors. During World War II, the Supreme Court determined that a U.S. citizen who had acted as a member of a belligerent invasion of the United States by joining a group of Nazi saboteurs who landed on shore might be treated as an enemy. History, therefore, suggests that an enemy is one who owes allegiance to an opposing government and not merely a U.S. citizen opposing the U.S. government or part thereof. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment refers to aid or comfort of enemies, not insurrectionists or insurgents. So the aid or comfort prong arguably would not be useful to target persons suspected of having provided support to the instigators of the January 6th unrest. On the other hand, if the reference to enemies of the Constitution of the United States does include such individuals, as one commentator argues, it may then be important to determine at which point they became enemies. I wonder who's arguing that. That also in Lawfare blog, Philip Zellico, writing on January 22nd, 2021, A Practical Path to Condemn and Disqualify Donald Trump. So it seems a little clearer that it could work against the president. We're still unclear about a member of Congress. What about implementation? That's the key. Section 3 does not appear to be a self-executing provision and does not expressly provide a procedure for its implementation other than Section 5's general authority of Congress to enforce the 14th Amendment by appropriate legislation. There might be multiple ways the Disqualifications Clause could be implemented, including relying on federal criminal prosecution for insurrection and treason, allowing private civil enforcement through writs quo warranto. Wow. Enacting new legislation establishing general procedures for adjudicating disqualification under Section 3, or for identifying specific disqualified individuals, or unicameral measures by the House or Senate to expel or exclude individuals from their respective houses. What follows is a discussion of a sampling of these alternatives and the novel legal questions they would pose. Ready to waste the next 10 minutes? Let's do it. It's an inquiry you won't get elsewhere, and maybe with good reason. Anyway, as previously mentioned, prosecutions for insurrection under 18 U.S. Code 2383, or treason under Section 2381, if successful, would result in a bar to holding any office of the United States. Consequently, any individuals convicted under those laws for engaging in activities related to the events of January 6th could be disqualified from holding current or future federal office without any specific congressional response to the events, and without regard to whether they had previously taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. A private injured party could also ask a judge to issue a writ of quo warranto to prevent the seating of or oust from office an individual who allegedly engaged in disqualifying activities. There'd be some test, though, whether or not you can oust from office a member of Congress. That would be very difficult. But you might be able to do it against other officers. By the way, the writ of quo warranto, brief definition being offered here, a Latin term meaning by what warrant. This refers to a legal procedure undertaken to cause a person or organization to 1. Cease its efforts or activities with regard to performing some act for which it may not have the legal right or authority, and 2. To state what right or authority it has to perform such actions. The remedies, by what authority or warrant. The name, there's more here. Okay, so more about remedies. Do we want to keep going with quo warranto? I think you get the general idea here. By what the name of is also a second definition here. The name of a writ issued in the name of a government against any person or corporation that usurps any franchise or office, commanding the sheriff of the county to summon the defendant to be and appear before the court whence the writ issued at a time and place therein named, to show quo warranto, by what warrant he claims the franchise or office mentioned in the writ. An old English practice also offer up as a definition here. A writ in the nature of a writ of right for the king against him who claimed or usurped any office, franchise, or liberty, to inquire by what authority he supported his claim. Okay, very interesting. Jumping back to where CRS was, although it's unclear who would have standing to bring such a suit, it is possible that opposing candidates or individuals eligible to hold the office in question could survive this constitutional prudential inquiry. Congress could also enact new legislation to enforce Section 3 in the aftermath of January 6th, much like it did in response to the Civil War. Congress initially provided enforcement of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment through enactment of the first Ku Klux Klan Act in 1870. Section 14 of that act directed the district attorney in each district in which a potentially disqualified person held office to file a writ of quo warranto against the office holder before a judge. Section 15 of the act made it a misdemeanor for a person disqualified under the 14th Amendment to hold state or federal office, enforcement of which required a court conviction. However, after 2 years, Congress reversed course by providing amnesty from the disqualification under the first Ku Klux Klan Act through enactment of the Amnesty Act in 1872. The Amnesty Act was passed by more than 2/3 vote in accordance with the Disqualifications Clause. The Ku Klux Klan Act provisions no longer appear in the U.S. Code, and Congress has not since exercised its authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to enact legislation providing a general procedure for the executive and judicial branches to determine who is subject to the bar on holding office. In contrast to general procedural legislation akin to the Ku Klux Klan Act, there is some debate as to whether Congress can enact a law naming specific individuals subject to disqualification. As is discussed in another legal sidebar, Some argue that Congress has that right under Section 3, while others counter that such a measure might conflict with the constitutional prohibition on bills of attainder. Sure, why not? The Supreme Court has described a bill of attainder as a law that legislatively determines guilt and inflicts punishment upon an individual, identifiable individual, without provision of the protections of a judicial trial. It is unclear whether legislation to implement Section 3 is subject to the constitutional prohibition on bills of attainder, or was instead intended as a constitutional exception to it. Whether disqualification from holding office constitutes punishment for the purposes of the Bill of Attainders Clause is unclear. Due to these uncertainties, legislation that specifically identifies individuals for disqualification would likely result in litigation. Oh, everything will result in litigation. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution provides the House and Senate with near complete control over their own membership through the distinct constitutional powers of exclusion and expulsion. Either of these powers could be used to enforce a disqualification under the 14th Amendment, at least with respect to an individual's ability to serve in Congress. That seems pretty clear. An exclusion occurs, of course, when either the House or the Senate refuses to seat a member-elect. That power derives from the Constitution's charge that each House shall be the judge of elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and may be achieved by the vote of a simple majority. An expulsion, on the other hand, occurs when either chamber removes one of its current members. That power derives from the Constitution's explicit statement that each House may, with the concurrence of 2/3, expel a member. As reflected in this provision, an expulsion requires 2/3 of that chamber. The power to expel is much broader in scope than the power to exclude. Both chambers have almost unbridled discretion to determine the type of misconduct that warrants expulsion. The Supreme Court has suggested, for example, that Congress's expulsion power extends to all cases where the offense is such as, in the judgment of the Senate or House, is inconsistent with the trust and duty of a member. That's all. Grounds for exclusion, however, are limited to those enumerated in the Constitution. In Powell v. McCormick, the court established that the Constitution leaves the House and Senate without authority to exclude any person duly elected by his constituents who meets all the requirements for membership expressly prescribed in the Constitution. As shown in the Berger experience, Congress has previously viewed Section 3 of the 14th Amendment as establishing an enumerated constitutional qualification for holding office, and consequently, grounds for possible exclusion.
From networksradio.com.
We actually made it to the end.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
What it didn't leave us was time to find out whether you understood all of what was said. But complicated legal questions, that much we can say. I'm still unconvinced about nullifying the power of the states to take care of this at the ballot qualification level. We'll find out more, but not necessarily from Justice Putnam. We'll take you in different directions next.